The year was 1907. The air in Phnom Penh was heavy, not with celebration, but with a silence that carried centuries of sorrow. For more than 100 years, the beating heart of Cambodia, Battambang and Siem Reap, the sacred lands that held Angkor Wat itself, had been torn away, swallowed by Siam's grip. To the Khmer people, this was more than lost territory. It was the bleeding of memory, the exile of their ancestors' spirit, and the shattering of their identity. But fate would intervene not through Khmer's strength, but through the cold hands of colonial ambition. France, the self-proclaimed protector of Cambodia, stood against Siam with treaties, threats, and naval might. In this clash of empires, Cambodia's stolen lands would finally be returned, but not to freedom. They would be handed back into the chains of another master, returned under French rule rather than Khmer sovereignty. This is the story of 1907, the year Cambodia reclaimed its sacred provinces, not with swords or fire, but through the shadows of diplomacy, empire, and betrayal. Part 1. The Strangled Kingdom. For centuries, the Khmer Empire had been the radiant jewel of mainland Southeast Asia. Angkor was once a city of 1 million souls, the largest in the pre-modern world, adorned with towers that reached for the heavens and irrigation canals that fed the earth like veins of a living god. But by the 19th century, Cambodia had become a shadow of its former self, torn between the rising powers of Siam to the west and Vietnam to the east. It stood like a drowning man pulled in two directions, unable to breathe. Among the deepest wounds inflicted on Cambodia was the loss of Battambang and Siem Reap, to provinces not only rich in rice, forests, and trade routes, but also the sacred keepers of Khmer identity. Within Siem Reap lay anchored the spiritual heart of the Khmer civilization. To lose these lands was not just a matter of territory, it was as though the soul of the nation had been cut out. That wound opened in 1794, when Siam, under King Rama I, formally annexed the provinces. What followed was more than a century of Siamese control, during which Khmer culture in these lands was suffocated, their resources extracted, and their people treated as pawns in a larger regional chessboard. While Phnom Penh was left to struggle under alternating Vietnamese and Siamese domination, the West was cut off, strangled from its motherland, locked behind a border that was more than geographical, it was spiritual exile. By the mid-19th century, Siam was ascendant, its court in Bangkok modernizing, learning from Western powers, and expanding its authority. Meanwhile, Cambodia was collapsing into weakness, too fractured to defend itself. In 1863, King Norodom, desperate to preserve what remained, signed a treaty of protection with France. From that day forward, Cambodia ceased to be its own master. While the French draped their promises in the language of salvation, they made clear that the kingdom would survive only as long as it suited their colonial ambitions. And here, in this entangled web of domination, the fate of Battambang and Siem Reap would be decided. The long shadow of loss, the loss of Battambang and Siem Reap, was not a silent event. For generations, Cambodian kings pleaded for their return. They petitioned Siamese courts, sent envoys with gifts, and prayed at Angkor's broken shrines for divine intervention. But Siam would not let go. For Siam, the annexed provinces were more than conquered land, they were strategic jewels. Battambang was fertile, supplying rice that fed Siamese armies. Siem Reap was symbolic, for holding Angkor meant holding the ancestral crown of the Khmer, and so Cambodia remained divided. The west was Siamese, the center and east, a French protectorate. The people of Battambang lived under Siamese governors, their Khmer identity eroded, their taxes filling Bangkok's coffers. Monks who once prayed in Pali and Khmer now bowed to Siamese appointed officials. Villagers taught their children to survive by silence, passing on memory in whispers. We are Khmer, we belong to Angkor. One day we will return. France enters the chessboard. By the late 19th century, Europe's colonial powers carved Southeast Asia like a carcass on a table. France had seized Vietnam, broken Laos from Siam in the Franco-Siamese War of 1893, and now eyed Cambodia as part of its Indo-Chinese Empire. But Battambang and Siem Reap remained beyond its grasp. France's appetite was not simply to protect Cambodia, it was to dominate the Mekong, to secure trade routes, and to humble Siam. Bangkok, under the reformist kings Rama IV and Rama V. Mongkut and Chulalongkorn, understood this danger. They modernized Siam's army, hired European advisors, and played the powers of Britain and France against one another. For a time, this delicate diplomacy saved Siam from outright colonization. But the western provinces of Cambodia were another matter. France would not rest until they were stripped from Siamese hands. Tensions mounted as France accused Siam of oppressing the Khmer population in Battambang, claiming they were a people awaiting liberation. This was colonial hypocrisy at its finest. France spoke the language of freedom while tightening its chains around Cambodia itself. Yet in this rhetoric lay the seeds of change. France began to position itself as the rightful guardian of Khmer lands, presenting Siam as an illegitimate occupier. The strangled kingdom for Cambodia. The late 19th century was a suffocating nightmare. The monarchy in Phnom Penh was weak, bound by French treaties that left no room for sovereignty. Kings became puppets. Their crowns were polished for ceremony, but powerless in reality. Taxes were collected not for Cambodians, but for French administrators and their schemes. Yet the greater wound was the absence of the West. How could a kingdom claim to be whole when Angkor itself was missing? The French, aware of this symbolic power, used it to tighten their hold. They reminded Cambodian elites that only under French protection could the ancient glory of Angkor be restored. In 1907, this narrative became their ultimate bargaining chip, the turning point. The early 20th century brought a climax to these tensions. France pressed Siam relentlessly, demanding the return of Battambang and Siem Reap. French officials framed it as justice, a rectification of history, and a promise to the Cambodian people. Siam resisted. These provinces were vital to their economy and pride, and to surrender them was to show weakness. But France wielded more than words. Behind its demands loomed the threat of force, the same navy that had humiliated Siam in 1893. The same imperial power that had seized half of Laos. Siam understood. Resists too far, and the entire kingdom might be swallowed. In 1907, the inevitable came. Under immense pressure, Siam signed a treaty with France. Battambang and Siem Reap were to be ceded, transferred not to an independent Cambodia, but to French-controlled Cambodia. The deal was dressed as diplomacy, but it was a coerced surrender. The return, but not to freedom. When the announcement reached Phnom Penh, Cambodians wept with joy and grief alike. Battambang and Siem Reap were returned, but not in truth. They were not restored to a free Khmer kingdom, but folded into a colonial map drawn in Paris. For the people, however, there was still relief. After more than a century, Angkor Wat was once again Cambodian soil, even if under foreign rulers. Monks walked barefoot into Angkor's courtyards and lit incense for the first time in generations. Farmers prayed to the ancestors that their children would no longer be forced to call themselves subjects of Siam. Yet the truth lingered like a shadow. Cambodia had not won these lands back by its own hand. They had been traded between empires, their people reduced to pawns. The kingdom remained strangled not by Siam, but by France. Legacy of the strangled kingdom. The events of 1907 left scars that endure. On paper, Cambodia seemed whole again. In reality, it remained a colony, its sovereignty stripped, its kings bound by colonial decrees. France restored Angkor as a monument, not for Cambodians, but as a jewel in its own empire, a showcase of its civilizing mission. Tourists from Paris marveled at temples while Khmer peasants toiled in poverty, unable to touch the riches of their own heritage. Still, for Cambodians, 1907 was a bittersweet moment of identity regained. It was proof that Angkor, Battambang, Siem Reap, these sacred lands could not be erased. They were symbols too deeply rooted to vanish. Though they came back in chains, they came back nonetheless. And with them, the hope that one day, Cambodia would rise again as master of its own destiny. Part 2. The Chains of a Treaty. The year was 1907, and the Kingdom of Cambodia, though clothed in the ceremonial robes of tradition, was a body bound tightly in chains. To the west lay Siam, its neighbor and rival, reluctant to part with the lands it had ruled for more than a century. To the east sat France, not as a neighbor but as a master, holding Cambodia inside its colonial grasp. In this crucible, the fate of Battambang and Siem Reap and the sacred city of Angkor would be decided not by Cambodians, but by signatures written in foreign tongues, on paper stamped in Bangkok and Paris. The Treaty of 1907 was not a gift. It was not justice served, nor a return of rightful heritage out of goodwill. It was the product of pressure, of humiliation, of Europe's dominance in Asia, and of Siam's desperate strategy to survive. For Cambodia, the treaty was a paradox. It restored the heart of the Khmer nation while tightening the shackles of colonial subjugation. The chains were real, though they glittered with the promise of Angkor's return. Siam's reluctance. Siam had annexed Battambang and Siem Reap in 1794. During an age when Cambodia had been torn apart by civil wars and foreign invasions. For over a century, Siamese kings and governors treated these provinces as part of their realm, integrating them into their economic and administrative systems. Generations of people were born under Siamese taxation, Siamese laws, and Siamese appointed leaders. For Siam, surrendering them was not simply handing over Cambodian lands. It was amputating living parts of its own body. King Chulalongkorn Rama V, the modernizer of Siam, understood the stakes better than anyone. He had spent decades reforming his kingdom to resist colonial encroachment, centralizing administration, abolishing slavery, and introducing Western-style education. He believed that only by appearing civilized in European eyes could Siam avoid being carved up like its neighbors. Yet the colonial giants, France and Britain, demanded sacrifices. In 1893, under French gunboat pressure, Siam had already surrendered Laos. Now, less than 15 years later, the French were back, demanding Battambang and Siem Reap. For Chulalongkorn to resist was dangerous. France could unleash its navy once more. To concede was humiliating, but in his heart, he knew the balance of power left no choice. Survival for Siam meant surrendering lands at the edge in order to preserve independence at the core. France's motives. For France, the demand for Battambang and Siem Reap was cloaked in lofty rhetoric. Colonial officials in Indochina spoke of restoring to Cambodia its historic lands, of reuniting the Khmer people with their sacred temples. Scholars and explorers such as Etienne Amenio and Louis Finot published glowing accounts of Angkor, framing it as a civilizational wonder whose preservation required French stewardship. But beneath the language of heritage lay the real motive: empire. France wanted secure borders for its Indo-Chinese territories. Laos was already under French control. Vietnam had long been colonized, and Cambodia had been a protectorate since 1863. The only loose stone in this arch was Siam's hold over Battambang and Siem Reap. By pulling those provinces into French Indochina, Paris could draw a clean map of control, erasing Siamese influence from the heart of the Mekong Basin. The French press, too, glorified the move as a civilizing mission, but Cambodians knew better. The return of their provinces would not mean freedom, it would mean another kind of foreign administration. Yes, the governors in Battambang would no longer answer to Bangkok, but neither would they answer to Phnom Penh. They would answer to Paris, through the resident superior in Phnom Penh, through colonial channels that placed Cambodia beneath France. The treaty negotiations. Negotiations between France and Siam stretched over years, conducted in Bangkok and Paris, with British observers watching closely but refusing to intervene. The French held the stronger hand. Their gunboats had already humiliated Siam in 1893. Their diplomats wielded international clout. The British, while wary of French expansion, preferred a stable Siam as a buffer state rather than a battleground. And so Siam stood alone, pressured from without, hesitant from within. At last, in March 1907, the treaty was signed. Siam ceded Battambang, Siem Reap, and Sisaphane to France to be absorbed into Cambodia under French rule. In return, France surrendered a small attractive territory on the Lao border to Siam, a concession designed to save Siamese pride, but of little real value compared to what had been lost. The balance was clear. Siam had yielded the jewel of Angkor, while France secured the centerpiece of its Cambodian protectorate. Cambodian reactions. For Cambodians, the news was received with both joy and bitterness. Joy, because after more than a century, Angkor was once again part of Cambodia. The temples that had been the cradle of Khmer greatness were no longer across a border, no longer under Siamese authority. Pilgrims, monks, and villagers could once again call Angkor part of their homeland. The symbolism was immense. The heart of the Khmer nation beat once more within its chest, but the bitterness was just as deep. This was not a victory won by Cambodian will. No Khmer king had led an army to reclaim Angkor. No rebellion had driven the Siamese out. Instead, the return came through a treaty signed by foreigners, negotiated in foreign capitals, under the shadow of colonial power. Angkor was back, but freedom was not. For the monarchy, the return of Angkor provided a fragile source of pride. King Sisawath, who sat on the throne under French supervision, could present himself as the ruler who had seen Cambodia's spiritual capital restored. Yet even he knew the truth. He had no power in the matter. The return was engineered entirely by Paris. The throne's dignity had been saved in symbol, but not in substance. The French recasting of Angkor. Almost immediately after the treaty, France turned Angkor into the jewel of its colonial showcase. The École Française d'Extrême Orient (ETFETO) began systematic restoration of the temples. Archaeologists, architects, and photographers descended upon Siem Reap, clearing jungle, stabilizing walls, and publishing grand studies. To the French imagination, Angkor was not just Cambodian, it was proof of their mission to protect and revive a civilization. Tourists, administrators, and scholars marveled at the grandeur of Angkor Wat, Bayon, and Ta Prohm. Yet the very process of restoration reinforced colonial hierarchy. The temples were presented not as living religious sites, but as monuments frozen in time, curated by Europeans. Khmer monks and villagers were often excluded from decisions about the ruins. The symbolism was cruel. Cambodia had regained Angkor, yet even Angkor itself was now under French supervision. The Siamese grief. For Siam, the treaty was a bitter wound. The loss of Battambang and Siem Reap was mourned not just in court but among the people. The provinces had provided vital rice supplies, manpower, and prestige. To lose them was to shrink Siam's map and weaken its pride. King Chulalongkorn, though praised for preserving Siam's independence against colonial conquest, carried this loss heavily. In his reforms, he had sought to strengthen Siam precisely to avoid such humiliations. Yet even the most modernized Asian kingdom could not withstand the combined weight of European empires. Some Siamese officials comforted themselves with the thought that the treaty had preserved Siam's sovereignty. Better to lose land at the edges than to lose the kingdom entire, as Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam had. This was true, but it did not erase the grief of surrendering Angkor, the very crown of Southeast Asian civilization. The chains tighten. For Cambodia, the Treaty of 1907 was a moment of recovery, but it also marked the tightening of chains. With Battambang and Siem Reap restored, France could now boast that it had given back Cambodia's heritage. This made colonial rule appear benevolent, even generous. Paris used the return as propaganda, showcasing France as the protector of Khmer identity. Yet in practice, Cambodia remained bound. Taxes were collected by French administrators. Trade was controlled by colonial monopolies. Education was limited and designed to serve the needs of the protectorate, not to empower Cambodians. The king remained a figurehead, the nobility a class of intermediaries. The people of Battambang and Siem Reap discovered that their Siamese governors had been replaced by French residents, not by their own leaders. The return of the provinces did not restore sovereignty. It merely shifted the weight of foreign domination from one side to another. Cambodia's chains gleamed brighter, but they were chains nonetheless. The Treaty of 1907 stands as one of the most paradoxical moments in Cambodian history. It was a triumph that felt like a loss, a return that revealed captivity, a healing of one wound while deepening another. For Cambodians, it meant the return of their ancestral heartlands, the chance once more to call Angkor their own. For Siam, it meant humiliation, the surrender of provinces that had been lifelines for more than a century. For France, it meant victory, the expansion of empire under the mask of justice. The chains of the treaty were invisible, yet heavy. They bound Cambodia to France more tightly than ever before. They reminded Siam that survival in the colonial age came at the price of territory, and they proved, above all, that the fate of small nations in the age of empire was decided not by themselves, but by the hands of greater powers. The kingdom of Cambodia, strangled for centuries, had regained its heart, but the heart now beat within a cage. The temples of Angkor rose again to the sun, but their shadow fell across a land still bound, still waiting, still dreaming of true freedom. Part 3. The Shadow of Lost Provinces. The Treaty of 1907 was signed. Battambang and Siem Reap along with the sacred ruins of Angkor were once again under the name of Cambodia. To outsiders, it looked like a moment of triumph. Newspapers in Paris spoke of France's generosity, of a benevolent empire that had returned the treasures of the Khmer race. In Phnom Penh, King Sisawoth staged ceremonies of celebration. Monks chanted blessings over Angkor Wat. Villagers from the Tonle Sap plains offered incense and flowers, and the air rang with the sound of gongs. But beneath the surface, shadows lingered. The shadow of loss, the shadow of humiliation, the shadow of provinces still missing from the Khmer embrace. For while Cambodia had regained Angkor, two of her oldest lands, Battambang and Siem Reap, were not truly free. They were no longer under Siamese governors, yes, but neither were they under the sovereignty of a Khmer king. Instead, they had passed into the hands of French residents, bound within the machinery of Indochina. And further still, a darker shadow lay to the west, the lost provinces that Cambodia would never see again, the phantom borders. In Cambodian memory, the lands of Battambang and Siem Reap were part of a continuum stretching deep into the Western Uprathat, Chanthaburi Trat, and the fertile plains beyond. These were places where Khmer kings had once reigned, where Khmer temples still stood in silence, their stones whispering of a forgotten sovereignty. In the age of Jayavarman VII, Khmer armies had ridden as far as Lopburi and the Menam Basin. Even in the 15th century, when Angkor fell, Cambodian kings still held sway over stretches of what would one day become Siam. By 1907, these lands had long been absorbed into the Siamese heartland, yet in Cambodian imagination, they were not forgotten. Every map the French drew to fix borders was a reminder that history had been cut apart, amputated. The treaty returned some provinces, but it also fixed a line of separation in ink, ensuring that what lay beyond would never return. The shadow of lost provinces was not only geographically, it was spiritual. It reminded the Khmer of how far their empire had fallen, of how much had been carved away by centuries of invasion, civil war, and foreign domination. France's showcase, Cambodia's silence. In the years after the treaty, the French turned Siem Reap into their greatest colonial showcase. Restoration at Angkor accelerated. Tourists from Europe and America arrived, marveling at the grandeur of a civilization they were told had vanished and been rescued by French scholarship. Postcards circulated across Paris, showing Angkor Wat in romantic twilight, captioned as though it were a monument preserved by French grace. For Cambodians, it was both pride and insult. Pride, because Angkor was again the center of their nation's identity. Insult, because they themselves were treated as spectators in their own land. Villagers who wished to continue worship at Ta Prohm or Bayon were often restricted. Monks found themselves pushed aside by archaeologists. The temples, though rooted in Khmer faith, were recast as museums of empire. Meanwhile, Battambang, a granary of Siam, was reorganized under French administration. Its rice fields were taxed to feed colonial coffers. Its population, once tied to Bangkok, was now tethered to Phnom Penh through French channels. In Phnom Penh itself, officials celebrated the return of the provinces, but the voice of ordinary Cambodians remained faint, muffled beneath layers of colonial authority. Siam's lingering wounds. In Bangkok, the treaty left scars that lasted for decades. Though King Chulalongkorn had been praised for preserving Siam's independence, many courtiers whispered that too much had been lost. The humiliation of losing Battambang and Siem Reap weighed heavily. For Siamese nationalists of the 20th century, the treaty became a symbol of injustice. Textbooks in Bangkok began to speak of the lost territories, framing Battambang and Siem Reap as lands unfairly taken by France. This resentment simmered for generations, later feeding into the fervor of Thai nationalism in the 1930s and 1940s, when leaders like Phibun Songkhram would claim those lands again under Japanese patronage during World War II. For Siam, the shadow of 1907 was not simply territorial, it was psychological, a reminder of vulnerability before Western powers. Cambodia's bitter gift, yet the greatest irony fell upon Cambodia itself. The return of Angkor, Battambang, and Siem Reap became a point of pride for colonial propaganda. France used it to justify its presence. Without us, Cambodia would have no Angkor. Without us, Cambodia would remain divided. It was a bitter gift. King Sisawath was paraded as the monarch whose reign had seen Cambodia enlarged, but he had no role in the negotiation. His throne remained bound, his movements dictated by the residents of Pula. When he traveled to Angkor in 1907, he did so not as a sovereign inspecting his realm, but as a guest of French officials who led him through the temples as though he were a tourist in his own kingdom. For the people of Cambodia, the reality was clear. The provinces had returned, but independence had not. The lost provinces haunted their imagination, and the shadow of French domination stretched longer than ever before. The shadow of Angkor, the shadow of the lost provinces, was embodied most of all in Angkor itself. Angkor stood as both a triumph and a wound. Its soaring towers reminded the Khmer of their greatness, but its foreign curators reminded them of their subjugation. Every tourist who marveled at Angkor reminded them that their land was now a spectacle for others, and so Angkor became a paradox, a source of unity and pride for Cambodians, but also a mirror of loss. It told them not only what they had been, but what they were not. It showed them not only their grandeur, but also their chains. The long echo of 1907, the consequences of the 1907 treaty, echoed for decades. It fixed the borders of Cambodia, more or less, as they stand today. It reshaped Cambodian identity around Angkor, even as the nation remained a colonial subject. It gave Siam the incentive to modernize further, hardening its nationalism to ensure that it would never again be forced into such humiliations. For Cambodians, however, the shadow of lost provinces persisted. Stories of lands to the west lived on in folk memory. Families remembered ancestors who had once traveled freely between Battambang and Bangkok. The temples across the board of Phnom Rung, Preavihir, Surin remained as silent witnesses, stones that still spoke Khmer words though they stood on Thai soil. The shadow was not just about land, it was about dignity. It was about the haunting knowledge that Cambodia's destiny had been written not in Phnom Penh, but in Paris and Bangkok. Closing reflections. The 1907 treaty was both a return and a theft, both a triumph and a tragedy. It gave Cambodia back its heart, but reminded it of its broken body. It bound Siam closer to survival, but left it scarred with resentment, and it crowned France with the illusion of generosity. when in truth it had only tightened its hold on Indochina. In the shadow of lost provinces, Cambodia moved forward into the 20th century, a nation with its sacred temples restored but its sovereignty stolen, a people proud of their past but uncertain of their future. The lost provinces were not just measured in miles of land, but in centuries of silence, humiliation, and longing. Even today, the Treaty of 1907 lingers as a ghost in Cambodian memory. It is remembered not only for what it gave back, but for what it confirmed, that the Khmer people, once the masters of empires, had become the pawns of powers. The shadow of the lost provinces stretched long into the future, whispering of wounds not yet healed, of dignity not yet reclaimed, of a freedom still waiting beyond the horizon.